When we enter the tutorial of the game, one of the first things we are being taught is how to navigate the level. Is it by using the mouse, the keyboard keys, or the analog sticks on the controller? Such a vital pillar of game design has gone under drastic changes over the different eras of gaming. Present in most games under some form, its objective is to assist the player in its goal to finish the game and never be a nuisance on the way. From a simple left to right movement, to a proper 2D movement scheme, to the archaic 3D movements of the 1990s, and now to the modern techniques and ideas where only the lack of creativity holds it back. This is what we will cover in this video: movement in video games. What is movement? In physics, it is the act or process of changing the position or posture of an object. In our case, the character we want to control. How do we achieve this in video games? A very easy way is to use vectors. These are a mathematical concept that represents the direction and magnitude of our physical object. With this concept in our hands, we can portray how our character is handled in the game world. In a 2D game, we can simply use 2D vectors that are formed with the X and Y components, X for horizontal and Y for vertical. Usually we use 3 vectors for this: position, velocity, and acceleration. The position vector simply specifies where our character is in our level. Velocity is current speed, and acceleration is the change in velocity over a period of time. But why is this important? We need to understand that the game engine needs to know what is happening to our character so that it does what it needs to do, like moving our character when input is sent, rendering new objects when we're supposed to see them, if we're close enough to pick an item, if collision happens, or if we finish the level, to name a few examples. The concept is similar for 3D games too, by the way. We swap over to 3D vectors, and that means we add a Z component into the mix. That is mostly used for stuff like rotations or depth. So, with all of these concepts known, what did we actually do with them? In the early days of video games, we didn't really have that many groundbreaking examples of amazing movement. It was relatively simple due to it being on a 2D canvas and developers still improving in terms of design. Or, in easier terms, not everything was very researched and documented as it is today. Realistically, developers at that time were still struggling to get a game out in any way, shape, or form, and as long as a character could get from point A to point B, then it sufficed. Even at the start, we did have the philosophy right in the sense that characters could move and jump. For a while, this was the main mechanic of some games, traversing levels while dodging incoming obstacles, and one of those games was Pitfall. Why this game is interesting is that we can use the environment to control our character, a gimmick at that time. A very interesting game is also Moon Patrol. It is one of the pioneers of parallax scrolling. While at a first glance it looks to be here to impress graphics wise, its role is a bit more interesting. Because the Atari 2600 doesn't have hardware scrolling like more modern consoles, and uses scan lines to draw on the screen the game and update it too, this means that making a continuous scrolling game can be a bit of an interesting task on this limited hardware. The scrolling in the background is to inform the player that they're moving, since the car doesn't move that much and can confuse the player whether they're moving or not. A very good solution to a limited hardware issue. During my research of movement in the Atari era, my favorite ones have to be Pole Position and River Raid. Let's start with Pole Position. It pretty much set the ground for upcoming racing games, as during this 2D era they were too ambitious for the hardware that was available at that time, and this genre would have an amazing boom when 3D would come. While the movement in this game is bare bones at best, at that time it was praised for a realistic experience. While it could have been corporation talk, they weren't wrong that it was a revolutionary game, and the fact that it was ported from the arcades to the Atari makes it even more impressive. The second game, River Raid, for me it's fascinating in another sense. The movement here doesn't feel like it aged, it just feels smooth and very responsive for such an old game. It does have the principles of accelerating and decelerating to dodge incoming attacks with very responsive left to right movement, making it one of those games that could realistically be remastered but only graphics wise. Moving in time a bit, we land straight into the NES era. It's a very interesting evolution of movement, as it didn't really change the formula, it improved upon it. Animations started to be more advanced, allowing for easier understanding as to what your character is doing. Simple animations as to when your character is trying to stop or when he's jumping, for example. Speaking of jumping, Now you can press the jumping input once for a very short time to jump a small height, or hold it for a longer period to make it a higher height, allowing for more control of the character in terms of verticality. We're going to end the NES era with Ninja Gaiden, who was also a pioneer when it came to wall jumping. While it is incredibly clunky for today's standards, this was pretty new as it allowed for more interesting platforming compared to other games. But when developers started to really get it perfectly was in the upcoming 16-bit era. We're going to be taking a look at two very popular titles since this era has a lot of good games and we have a limited time. These games are Sonic the Hedgehog 2 and Super Mario World. We chose these because the developers of those two had a different philosophy when it came to designing their mascots' abilities to move. Let's start with Super Mario World. Mario's movement throughout the game remains close to the original with a few exceptions. And the idea was, why break what already works? Sure, they added the spin jump, but when playing the game, it is mostly used for defeating enemies, and besides a few moments, you don't really need it to complete levels. The new cape, on the other hand, would allow Mario to fly and pretty much break levels if used correctly. And here's the oversight of the game developers. Mario World works on the idea that the levels are designed first, then Mario. Had it been the other way around, then levels would have more hazards in the air to not allow this type of behavior. You can fly and dodge pretty much the whole level without any risk of losing it, and you break the game upside down due to this. What I want to point out is that by modifying the levels a bit, these new movement abilities can be removed and the game will still function fine and still have a very good movement set. And as I mentioned earlier, this means that when they designed the game, they designed the levels first and adapted Mario to whatever challenges are thrown and give a tool for it if the base toolkit doesn't work for the level's gimmick. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 is a bit different. The game is based on Sonic's speed to traverse the level. It increases by simply moving in the same direction for a long period of time or going downhill, with a lot of those mechanics being dependent on Sonic's speed, which is the same throughout the game as every level is designed and balanced around the speed you get from level 1. Sonic 2 pretty much took what was really good about Sonic 1 and doubled down on it. Fast sections, crazy jumps, and roller coasters. All of these achieved by simply creating a strong movement foundation. In Sonic 1, Sonic Team spotted an issue. The sections mentioned earlier require you to have a certain amount of momentum to pass. This meant that you needed to backtrack a bit and hope you get the speed needed to go up a slope, for example. A way to fix this was to add the spin dash. This tool allows the player to get an immediate boost of speed to make sure you're always going the direction you want and not the one you came from, while barely affecting the level design, and the reception of it was so positive that it made continuous appearances in upcoming Sonic games. Sega knew that they hit gold with the Hedgehog's simple movement, so they only fixed the issue of Sonic 1's lack of spin dash and left him untouched overall. This means that the pressure is on the level design team to create around Sonic. We need the levels that try to push the current movement to its limits. The levels have to be big so we have doses of speed with moments of awe, and it also needs to be said that the designers are handcuffed by the character that they have, because if Sonic cannot overcome the obstacle, that section needs to be redesigned or an outside tool has to be created in the level offering the opposite of Mario's design, where different power-ups and design philosophies allow him to be more flexible. There are obviously many other great games who treat movement like these, but there are dozens of them and the idea is generally the same. It took developers a long time to get something new, something pretty revolutionary for that time. One of the golden ages of gaming was when 3D games started appearing and both consoles and PCs were starting to really pick it up. Now we get a new toy to play with and it required better tools to traverse the terrain we were presented with. For some games it was easy to transition. The FPS genre spawned the famous AASD movement and allows for beautiful point A to point B movement. Racing games took a massive leap in terms of controls, while platformers now had more ways to express level design, just to name a few examples. But that doesn't mean there were no growing pains. The PlayStation 1 controller at release didn't have analog sticks. Games, even though they were in 3D, they still had this janky 2D style movement blasted in 3D environments due to it only having these arrow buttons on the left side. Don't imagine that analog sticks at that time were also very precise after their appearance, as this was still a new technology and developers still had no idea how to implement proper stick movement yet. The Nintendo 64 came with a controller that had an analog stick by default, and Nintendo understood its importance in upcoming games. but it was only one. Developers were not necessarily limited in terms of movement, but in the movement of the camera that indirectly made the character movement very clunky sometimes. To show you exactly what I mean, let's take a look at Perfect Dark. The default control scheme is that the analog stick moves you forward or backwards. Moving the stick to the left or right would turn the character into respective directions, and the C buttons allow your character to strafe left or right or move the camera up or down. As you can imagine, it's incredibly clunky for today's standards, but admirable because it does have some idea of modern schemes. I can say that most of the time it works at least, and it rarely messes you up since you can get used to it, especially with the very heavy auto aim that helps you massively. But we are in 2023 and we can do some magic with the help of emulation. We can run Perfect Dark with a mouse and keyboard and the game completely changes. The fluidity of how your character controls is absolutely criminal. Agent Dark is much smoother than before simply because she can do two things at once. Be able to much more easily move the camera, and strafing around corners is much simpler, to name some examples. The only downside to it is that the game just wasn't made for this scheme and the levels are just a pushover compared to when using a controller. Another subject I want to talk about is the tank movement scheme that is similar to what I explained in Perfect Dark. The games with this scheme that I chose to talk about are Resident Evil 1 and Tomb Raider 1, for a few specific reasons. We'll start with Resident Evil 1. The director for the game, Shinji Mikami, said in an interview that the tank movement was intentional. While I can understand that it added to the horror effect, it made me think about something else. There is the Resident Evil 1 remake that is pretty much a faithful remaster, and we can compare how the game could be with more modern schemes. Now we can control our character with the analog stick and change directions instantly. As you can imagine, this can break the game really bad sometimes, like in our previous example. Dodging zombies is incredibly easy with some practice, the clumsiness of the character goes away in very narrow corridors, and the only time you would think about using the old movement scheme is to aim if you actually need to, or you know a really long walking section is coming with multiple camera angles. Even with my soft spot of classic horror games, after playing the remake it's really hard to go back to the original Resident Evil 1. It does have its charm and its impact is still the same even after these years, but flexing between the two schemes in the remake just feels really good, and having the choice between both is always the way I would take. Tomb Raider 1 also has tank controls, but it was praised for very good controls even though there was no analog stick involved. The game appeared before the analog stick controls were even here for the developed consoles, so any idea of a complex movement scheme was thrown out the window immediately. But in the upcoming Tomb Raider games, they also maintain the tank controls, so what happened? I suspect it's a combination of game design with hardware or engine limitations. The levels in Tomb Raider 1 are made out of a grid system with a multitude of primitive shapes to form the level. This was a massive hardware limitation because of the Saturn and PlayStation, as they couldn't have very complex models. This forced core design to create the tank controls, and realistically speaking, something more complex wasn't needed due to the simple nature of objects present in the game. As long as you have simple levels, the movement stays simple too. What about climbing the objects? How did the developers manage to do that? If you've played the game, you will notice a few simple giveaways. For people who are familiar with programming, it is simple conditional logic based on what Lara is doing and what's around her. For people who are not familiar with programming, I'll explain it this way. The game has an action button and a jump button that tells the game engine in what state Lara is. The jump button would act as a make Lara jump but never make her climb or attach to anything. If it's combined with the action button, then she will attach to a ledge if the hands come in contact with one. The action button can be described as if you are near a tall object with a ledge, grab it and attach to it. Or if you are next to a low object that is climbable, then climb it. Rare was incredibly close when it came to setting the trend for twin stick controls with GoldenEye. It's just that, as I mentioned earlier, the Nintendo controller let it down. GoldenEye and Perfect Dark were games that were able to use two analog sticks for moving and aiming, which as you can imagine was unheard of. The issues were that you needed two controllers, and I'm not aware of a human with 4 hands that can handle two controllers at the same time. Here comes Alien Resurrection, which was known to use both analog sticks on the DualShock to both move and control the camera by default. If it was dumb luck or genius thinking, I can't find. But it stuck with people, and while it did receive some negative feedback from specific journalists, it did pave the way for how future games will be utilizing the twin stick controls. Modern times requires modern movement. Developers in today's games have gone above and beyond when it came to movement because the hardware and engine limitations are now gone. Whatever we imagine, it probably can be done. Mirror's Edge has pushed boundaries when it came to what your character can do in a first-person perspective. DICE decided to make a game that would simulate a parkour experience. And while the idea isn't impressive, making a game like this requires an incredible number of animations and fluidity in feeling that few developers manage to get even today. While our favorite runner didn't spawn anything new in recent years, its ideas are still fragmented throughout multiple FPS games even today. Third-person games have also pushed movement to its limit multiple times. The Assassin's Creed took the torch from Prince of Persia when it came to parkour, and with the help of modern consoles, it has spawned a movement system that would remain a staple in the long list of sequels. Gears of War spearheaded the cover system. While Winback takes the credit for creating it in a 3D environment, it sadly never caught the mainstream and it was really janky even for its time. The Gears series managed to make it more fluid plus accessible, and it created multiple games that tried to mimic this cover system. Fighting games are a genre split into 2D and 3D fighters. Every step in a 2D fighter is incredibly important as cornering is present and getting out of it is very hard. Air combat is still present here compared to 3D, where it rarely gets implemented. In a 3D game, getting cornered is really hard with the addition of sidesteps and massive arenas. Games like Tekken have showed us movement can be a weapon in a 3D fighter, with top level players proving that every step can be fatal. Racing games literally get defined by their type of movement. Games like Need for Speed are arcade racers for their unrealistic approach to how a car handles, or simulation games that try to mimic real life as much as they can, like the Assetto Corsa series. The list can go on for a very long time and throughout different genres and subgenres, but this is what I wanted to point out: its importance in whatever game you play, even when aware or unaware. Many developers know how vital it is, and these things that look small to us, for some developers it is necessary that their player enjoys it. Until next time, take care my fellow gamers.